Hello, I have the next story I'm going to read. I'm trying to hold the book and read the title. This one is on Mary McLeod, and I don't know if it's Bethune. Bethune. She's an educator. She's born in South Carolina, and she was born in 1875. So, yep, that is who I'm going to read about. So sit back and enjoy. I'm going to flip this phone down and try to put it closer to where you can hear. Okay, there it is. Before Mary McLeod Bethune became impressive and extraordinary, she was just a little colored girl in a town near Maysville, South Carolina, so small that it never even became a dot on the map. She was born on July 10th, 1875, to parents who had both been slaves, Patsy and Samuel. As for their last names, these they shared with who knows how many others owned by two prosperous landowners of Scottish descent. Patsy was raised on the McIntosh farm near Maysville, Samuel on the McLeod plantation, not far away. When Patsy and Samuel fell in love, they were allowed to seal their love with marriage, but there was a price. Samuel would have to buy his beloved. He managed to do this by working the fields of nearby planters and farmers in between and around his labors for his owner. It took time, but eventually Patsy and Samuel became husband and wife. After emancipation, Patsy and Samuel found a way to purchase some farmland between Maysville and the town of Sumter, and on it the family built a log cabin. The homestead was what they named their place. They fished from its streams. They hunted small, feathered, and furry game from its woods. They supplemented their meals with vegetables and fruits from their garden. On the rest of the land, they raised their cash crop, cotton for money to buy the rest of life's necessities for this family of 15 children. Mary Jane McLeod was the first to be born at the homestead, and soon she had two more sisters. There's no telling all the skills and abilities Mary inherited or learned from her parents, but they included the importance and value of hard work. As a child, she worked in the cotton fields along with her brothers and sisters. One of her early memories was of picking about 250 pounds of cotton a day and being hitched up to the plow to turn the soil when the family's mule died. Mary was very strong and quite capable at cooking and other household chores, like laundry. Mrs. McLeod needed a lot of help with this because in addition to having a large family, she did laundry for local white people. The McLeods were very sincere Christians. They passed their faith on to their children, a faith bound up in the high call of social service. The McLeods exhibited their commitment to the gospel of Jesus Christ by such things as opening their home to their neighbors for worshiping services. They further practiced what the gospel preached by sharing food and other goods with their neighbors and people who were just passing through, regardless of color or creed. If someone needed something and the McLeods had it, they gave. Well, before she was a teenager, Mary Jane McLeod was rooted and grounded in the principle of do for self and do for others too. And Mary was hungry for learning. It was a hunger that had been aroused when she was a child. Another of her memories from childhood was an incident that occurred one day. She went with her mother to deliver a load of laundry. The customer's granddaughter let her play with her toys, among which was a book. When Mary went to hold this book in her hands, another child chided her with, "Put that down, you can't read." But Mary would learn. When in 1882 a missionary named Emma Wilson opened a school in Maysville Trinity Presbyterian Church, Mary was more than eager to attend, as was true of countless other African American girls and boys. Mary's parents had taught her what David Walker had meant when he said in his appeal, quote, "For colored people to acquire learning in this country makes tyrants quake and tremble on their sandy foundation," end of quote. Walker had written this in 1829, but when Mary McLeod was growing up in the 1880s, not a lot had changed. During Reconstruction, many whites from the North had organized and supported schools for African Americans, but the overwhelming majority of white Southerners were staunchly opposed to this. As historian John Hope Franklin said, education was, quote, the greatest single opportunity to escape the indignities and proscriptions of an oppressive white South, end of quote. This is the last thing a great many white people wanted to happen. African Americans and white Northerners worked hard building schools during Reconstruction, and they faced enormous dangers in the process. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups worked just as hard to force schools to close. Schoolhouses were burned down. Teachers and students were beaten, and some were murdered. Hundreds of African Americans who went to school in those days not only sacrificed their time and a little bit of money, but also their blood. Mary McLeod did not experience such violence when she went to school, but her going had its hardships. Her school was about 5 miles away, and she had to walk each way at the end of the day. In addition to homework, there was housework to do as well. After she graduated from the Trinity Presbyterian Mission School for Negroes in 1886 with a head full of knowledge she would share with her family, she was once again a full-time worker at the homestead. There was no high school for African Americans in the area. Mary thought that all the schooling she had gotten would be all she would ever get. But then one day, her former teacher, Emma Wilson, paid the McLeods a visit bearing some very good news. And I really think I am pronouncing their name wrong because it's McLeod's. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's M-C, capital L, little E-O-D-S. There was a scholarship to Scotia Seminary, now Barber Scotia College, in Concord, North Carolina. It was a gift from a Quaker woman in Denver, Colorado, named Mary Chrisman, who had heard of the work Emma Wilson had been doing at her school and wanted to give a promising student a chance to build on the foundation Wilson had laid. Mary McLeod had been chosen, and her community rejoiced along with her, helping her with clothing and other necessities. When she boarded the train on a fall day in 1887, a crowd of well-wishers were at the station bidding her Godspeed. Mary didn't get a free ride at Scotia. The Chrisman Scholarship did not cover all her expenses, just tuition. Mary worked off the bill for room and board by doing laundry and janitorial work at the school. Money was so tight that she was unable to go home for the holidays. During summer vacation for the next few years, Mary worked as a domestic in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, and in Virginia. When school was back in session, she continued to work at odd jobs at Scotia and around town. Through it all, her studies never suffered. English was her best subject, and her love of music and her sweet soprano voice were cultivated. As she approached graduation, Mary made steps toward moving on to what she had long believed was her calling. To be a teacher would have been anyone's guess, but this wouldn't have been quite right. For all these years, Mary McLeod had been readying herself for service as a missionary in Africa. As she wrote the Moody Bible Institute when applying for admission, "It is my greatest desire to enter your institute for the purpose of receiving biblical training in order that I may be fully prepared for the great work which I trust I may be called to do." The Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, Illinois, founded in 1886 by evangelist Dwight L. Moody, was one of the leading training grounds for Christian workers. Chicago was a big, active city. It had some of everything, including rivers of poor African Americans who had been among the many who had come to the North looking for jobs and relief from the terrors of the South. While some had prospered, others, bunched up on the city's south side, had not. Although her sights were set on helping black Africans, McLeod did not ignore the plight of her fellow black Americans. She visited them in jails and in their squalid apartments. She comforted them with her singing and with the word. After a year's study, she went to the Presbyterian Board of Missions in New York, seeking a post in Africa. Her request was denied. The reason? The board was opposed to sending African American missionaries to Africa. It had been the ambition of her life, and now the greatest disappointment in my life is how she would describe it. Hopes dashed, heart and mind in confusion, Mary McLeod returned south and to her alma mater, by then Maysville Institute, where she served as assistant to her former teacher, Emma Wilson. It wasn't long before she was transferred to Haynes Normal and Industrial Institute in Augusta, Georgia. Haynes had been started by the dynamic Lucy Laney, who allowed McLeod a good deal of freedom in her teaching. Classwork went beyond the discussion and memorization of scripture. McLeod students went to the community of the poor, delivering clothing and other necessities people had donated to the school. When McLeod transferred to Kendall Institute in Sumter, South Carolina, she instituted the same kind of program there. At the same time, she was assisting her family with money so that her two sisters could go to school and her parents could dig themselves out of debt. It was in Sumter that Mary met Albertus Bethune, whom she married in May 1898 and followed to Savannah, Georgia, where he had secured a teaching job and where their only child, Albertus McLeod Bethune, was born. This marriage was apparently not a match made in heaven. Although they never divorced, their marriage was essentially over early on. While it was normal for a husband to leave home for work wherever he found it, rarely did a wife do this. When a Presbyterian minister visiting from Palatka, Florida, Palatka, Florida, who had heard about her fine work at Haynes and Kendall, offered her a job at his church school, Mary McLeod Bethune said yes. With her husband's lukewarm blessing, she was soon on her way to Palatka with Albertus Jr. There, she supplemented her income from teaching by selling insurance for the Afro-American Life Insurance Company in Jacksonville. During her years in Palatka, Bethune helped to start two schools and made time for other good work, such as ministering to prisoners. Then one day, in 1903, she saw an opportunity to do even more 50 miles southeast, where ditches were being dug and track was being laid for the Florida East Coast Railroad. Much of the labor would be done by African Americans who were pouring into Daytona Beach, where the major construction on the railroad was going on. With the influx of migrant workers and their families, Daytona Beach's African American community would need a good school, Bethune reasoned. How else to break the cycle of poverty? What better way to empower the children of these workers to do more with their lives than follow in their parents' footsteps as cheap labor? The Presbyterian Board of Missions' rejection almost a decade ago would turn out to be one of the best things that ever happened to Black America. Bethune journeyed to Daytona Beach to investigate the viability of starting a school, and within a few days she made up her mind to go ahead. Not because she had guarantees of funding or other kinds of tangible support, but because her faith had been encouraged by a dream she had a few nights after her arrival. As she slept, she had a visit from one of her idols, Booker T. Washington, whose Tuskegee Normal Industrial Institute in Alabama had become the model for many schools. In the dream, by a riverside, Washington handed her a diamond, telling her that it was for her school. Bethune took this as a sign that a way would be made for her to build her school, and she proceeded, operating totally on faith of God. Bethune's Daytona Educational Industrial Training School for Negro girls was founded in October 1904. It had very humble beginnings, threadbare quarters in a small house, starting capital in the amount of $1.50. A student body of 5 girls, ages 8 to 12, and 1 little boy, Bethune's son. With regard to the furnishings and other supplies she and her students would need, Bethune had faith that these things would be provided somehow. She did not, however, sit around waiting for manna from heaven. Bethune put hands and feet to her faith, as she recounted years later. We burned logs and used the charred splinters as pencils. For ink, we mashed up elderberries. Strangers gave us a broom, a lamp, some cretonne to drape around the ugly packing case which served as my desk. Day after day, I went to the city dump and visited trash piles behind hotels, looking for discarded linen and kitchenware, cracked dishes and shattered chairs. I became adept at begging for bits of old lumber, bricks, and even cement. Salvaging, reconstructing, and making bricks without straw were all a part of our training. Bethune was ingenious in the art of make-do. She was also a very resourceful and diligent fundraiser. Her strategies included selling pies, rallying her community to sell dinners on behalf of the school, asking locals to donate some of their harvest or catch of the day, and touring the town with the school choir for any loose change pleased listeners might give. Where did I go? Sometimes she simply asked for money without offering anything in exchange, except her assurance that she would build girls' minds and talents so that they would grow up to be self-sufficient, fruitful, decent women. They will be trained, she promised, in head, hand, and heart. Their heads to think, their hands to work, and their hearts to have faith. When it came to raising money for the school, Bethune was tireless. I rang doorbells and tackled coal prospects without a lead. I wrote articles whoever would print them, distributed leaflets, rode interminable miles of dusty roads on my old bicycle, invaded churches, clubs, lodges, chambers of commerce. If a prospect refused to make a contribution, I would say thank you for your time, no matter how deep my hurt. I always smiled. I refused to be discouraged, for neither God nor man could use a discouraged soul. Many trusted in Bethune, contributing pennies, nickels, dimes, dollars, and whatever else they could toward this school whose student body grew and grew and grew. In 1907, Bethune went in search of more space, finding a tract of land serving at the time as a city dump. After negotiating the purchase price down from $250 to $200, she persuaded the owner to agree to a payment of $5 down at $5 a month. This dump was known as Hellhole, but Bethune soon changed that. In time, the dump was transformed into a thriving garden with a dormitory and several small colleges for courses in such trades as rug weaving and broom making. There was also a hospital named after Bethune's mother, and a farm on which students grew food for their own table and to sell at market. Faith Hall is what Bethune named the school's main building. By 1922, the school was a solid, vigorous place of learning with about 300 students, including more than a handful of boys, which led Bethune to change the name to Daytona Normal and Industrial Institute. These boys would soon have more male companionship because in 1923, Bethune agreed to a merger of her school with the Darnell Cookman Institute in Jacksonville, creating the institution that eventually became Bethune-Cookman College. What Bethune had accomplished in 20 years was a major achievement by anyone's standards, as Elaine E. Smith explains in her profile of Bethune and notable Black American women. Bethune conducted her institute in the head, heart, hand tradition. Initially, intellectual fare translated into instruction to the 8th grade, but after World War I, it included a high school incorporating teacher training. From 1911 to 1927, through the Institute's hospital, a respectable nurse training course was offered. Heart education at the school meant worship, Bible study, and temperance training, but also meant outreach programs, farmer conferences on campus, a mission school in a turpentine camp, a summer school, and a playground for local children, and community holiday projects. Hand education centered on producing and handling food, and then sewing. To some people today it might seem if Bethune did not encourage young people to set their sights very high. Not true. She was doing her best to prepare them for the realities of the society in which they lived. Even though this was the 20th century, very few African Americans had the opportunity to pursue such careers as architect, attorney, or engineer. It was a major feat when one was given a job at the post office above that of janitor. There were many college-educated men who were porters for the railroad, and women with, for example, the ability and ambition to be physicians who were flatly denied admission into medical schools. In the days when Bethune School was on solid footing, most African Americans were on the bottom of the economic ladder, eking out a living as sharecroppers and domestics in the South and as laborers and servants in the North. With the education Bethune offered, more African Americans in the next generation would be able to attain a better standard of living as skilled workers, artisans, teachers, and semi-professionals. Equally important, graduates of Bethune School would have more to pass on to their children, preparing them to excel as opportunities opened up. As Bethune was building this institution, she also had been building her base of support, attracting donations from wealthy white people, both those who lived in Florida and those who only wintered there. Among her local supporters were the very rich members of the Palmetto Club, a social and philanthropic women's organization. Bethune's supporters from the North included industrialists John D. Rockefeller Sr. and James N. Gamble of the household products manufacturing company Procter & Gamble of Cincinnati, Ohio. Another major benefactor was Thomas H. White of Cleveland, Ohio, owner of White Sewing Machine Company. His generosity toward the school was sparked during a visit where he saw students working on a Singer sewing machine. His main competition, whereupon he promptly dominated one of his machines and then followed up with much more. It was he who was largely responsible for the completion of Faith Hall and who inspired James N. Gamble to contribute heavily toward the purchase of a house that became Bethune's home, the Retreat. "For I am my mother's daughter," Bethune wrote in 1941, "and the drums of Africa still beat in my heart. They will not let me rest while there still is a single Negro, boy or girl, without a chance to prove his worth." Bethune did not spend a whole lot of time at the Retreat or anywhere else being idle. Bethune-Cookman College was just one of her accomplishments. Among the others she spent her time and energy were 1924 to 1928, the president of the National Association of Colored Women. 1935 to 1949, president of the National Council of Negro Women. 1936 to 1943, director of the National Youth Administration's Division of Negro Affairs. 1936 to 1943, member of the Federal Council of Negro Affairs. 1936 to 1951, president of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Bethune made a mark in all of these positions. However, her most far-reaching work was with the NACW and the NCNW and in President Franklin Roosevelt's administration. As president of the National Association of Colored Women, Bethune put her fundraising expertise to work so the organization could purchase a building that would serve as its national headquarters in Washington, D.C. Now the organization would literally have a presence in the nation's capital. "Lifting as we climb" was the NACW's motto. And Bethune pushed her 10,000 sisters to not limit their lifting to the local arena, but to broaden their activities to the national level. She also pushed the organization to think interracially and globally. The NACW was the strongest black women's organization in the United States and in the world at the time, but it was not the only one. There were dozens of others around the nation with a collective membership of about 800,000. What if all these groups were to have an umbrella organization, Bethune wondered. In November 1935, Bethune gathered together with a group of other women to discuss the formation of just such a group. They met at New York City exclusive Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which refused to serve them. Bethune's formidable fuss made them change their minds. This incident was relatively mild compared with the discrimination other African Americans experienced on a daily basis. With her super organization, Bethune would tackle it all, as well as women's rights. The mission of this new group, the National Council of Negro Women, was manifold. Among its primary objective was this: to educate, encourage, and effect the participation of Negro women in civic, political, economic, and educational activities and institutions. Before long, the National Council of Negro Women was being recognized nationally and internationally as the voice of African American women, and Bethune was being recognized as one of the most important leaders in Black America. In 1935, a group of newspapers hailed her as one of the most influential women in the United States. The NAACP awarded her its prestigious Spingarn Medal, Spingarn Medal. Just the fact that I can't pronounce some of these words, and I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing her name right, lets you kind of know where our education is at, I have never heard of her, even though, the NAACP, I know to read as the NAACP because I've heard of it. I'm not saying NAACP. But anyway, just a little added note there. Okay, Bethune, Bethune, which, once again, I apologize if I am pronouncing these names wrong, was her people's friend at court when it came to government affairs. Her most historic position was as member of the Federal Council on Negro Affairs. President Franklin Roosevelt cluster of advisors on issues pertinent to Black America. The group was nicknamed the Black Cabinet. Of all her colleagues, Bethune's words carried the most weight. This was due to who she was and all that she had done, and it did not hurt that she had a friendship with the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, a serious advocate of civil and women's rights. Just when you look at the name Roosevelt, I would say Roosevelt, right? Eleanor Roosevelt. But I know to say Roosevelt. Just adding that, in our pronunciation of words, when you haven't heard about these people and you haven't heard these names being talked about, how are you going to know how to pronounce them? So I'm kind of pronouncing it phonetically. President Roosevelt, or I should just say President Roosevelt, was committed to the advancement of all Americans. That is what his New Deal policies were all about. With Bethune around, Black America would not be left out of the program. Thus, for example, through her work with the National Youth Administration, a job training and job placement agency for people aged 16 to 24, roughly 500,000 African American youths received almost as good a deal as their white counterparts. Bethune stepped down from the presidency of Bethune-Cookman College in 1943. Her chronic asthma was beginning to take a toll on her activities. She cut back, but she did not cease. Among the ways she did not rest was serving as advisor to various civic and educational organizations and institutions, and being Black America's representative to several national and international events and conferences, including the April 1945 50-Nation Conference in San Francisco, California, from which would emerge the United Nations. Mary Jane McLeod Bethune suffered a fatal heart attack on May 18, 1955. 3 months later, in August, Ebony magazine published her bequest to her people entitled My Last Will and Testament, which she had completed shortly before her death. As the editor's note that accompanied Ebony's reprint of the piece years later states, it is indeed one of the great documents of our time, and as relevant today as it was when she wrote it. Here is some of what she left her people. I leave you love. Love builds. It is positive and hopeful. It is more beneficial than hate. Love thy neighbor is a precept which could transform the world if it were universally practiced. I leave you hope. Yesterday our ancestors endured the degradation of slavery, yet they retained their dignity. Tomorrow a new Negro, unhindered by race taboos and shackles, will benefit from more than 330 years of ceaseless striving and struggle. I leave you a thirst for education. Knowledge is the prime need of the hour. And there's dots after this. It's not the full thing. This would be very interesting to get the full document. I think I'm going to look for that. I leave you racial dignity. I want Negroes to maintain their human dignity at all costs. I leave you finally a responsibility to our young people. The world around us really belongs to youth, for youth will take over its future management. Our children must never lose their zeal for building a better world. They must be discouraged from aspiring toward greatness. What? I read that wrong. Let me reread that one. Rewind. I leave you finally a responsibility to our young people. The world around us really belongs to youth, for youth will take over its future management. Our children must never lose their zeal for building a better world. They must not be discouraged from aspiring toward greatness. Not too many years after her death, owing to the work of one of her proteges, Dorothy Height, who became president of the National Council of Negro Women in 1957, work began on the creation of the Mary McLeod Bethune Memorial to be placed in Washington, D.C.'s Lincoln Park. It would be the first monument honoring either a woman or an African American in a public park in the nation's capital. The monument, unveiled in 1974 and which faces the Capitol building, is composed of 3 figures: Bethune herself with a girl and a boy. The 12-foot tall bronze statue of the indomitable Bethune in her senior years looks ahead as if into the future as she hands her legacy, represented by a scroll, to the 2 young people. So that is the story of Mary McLeod Bethune, Bethune, Educator, born in South Carolina in 1875. And I hope that you enjoyed this story and story about a person. And I'm going to end this, and I hope I didn't really mangle some of the pronunciations of the words, but I'm just not familiar with this. And that is just really sad if you think about it. All right. Peace.